Good morning, everybody. My name is Catherine Augustine, and I am the director of the RAND office here in Pittsburgh, and I'm also honored to be a board member on Eradicate Hate. And this opening panel will explore the latest trends in hate-fueled violence. The discussion will address topics from emerging threats to changing tactics across the spectrum of multiple forms of targeted and hate-based violence. It will set the stage for the rest of our time together. The panel will be moderated by Sasha Havlicek. Sasha is the founder and CEO of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Sasha has incubated and scaled global initiatives to counter the rise of weaponized hate, disinformation, and extremism, both online and offline. She describes the Institute for Strategic Dialogue as a think and do tank. She will facilitate and join in a dialogue between two panelists. George Salim is the Senior Vice President for National Affairs at the Anti-Defamation League. In this role, George leads all external engagement at the federal, state, and local levels, as well as community and civic engagement efforts nationally. George Salim is joined by Ambassador Mark Wallace. Mark is the CEO of Counter Extremism Project, which launched in September 2014 as a not-for-profit, nonpartisan, international policy organization whose mission is to combat the growing threat from extremist ideologies. Prior, Mark served as ambassador to the United Nations and most notably sought to uncover corruption in UN programs in such places as North Korea. He exposed the Cash for Kim corruption scandal there, which you'll have to ask him about when you see him in the hallways after this panel. And for now, please join me in welcoming Sasha, George, and Mark.
A very, very good morning to everybody. It is my distinct pleasure and great honor to be here to preside over this first panel of this extremely important convening here in Pittsburgh. Just days, as Brett said, before the anniversary of the terrible Tree of Life attack. We've been asked to think a little bit about what is new since we last convened, in fact, on this very stage for this very panel on the state of hate just a year ago. And I think it's critical for us to take stock of the implications, global ramifications, of the devastating Hamas attack on Israel and the ensuing war in Gaza. In my work at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, our global teams are seeing the fallout in terms of the tensions that are playing out, sometimes violently, within communities, between communities, literally around the globe. The impact of these global crises could not be more devastating at the very local level. And so it's with that I think we start with a reckoning for all of us. How is it we've taken so many steps forward, and yet these moments show us that much of that is vulnerable and can backslide? In fact, we see backtracking in many regards. And so with that, I'd love to put a couple of slides on the screens here. One of these is George's slide. I would love you to speak to a little bit.
Sure.
But just as we think about this, the ramifications of what is happening in the Middle East this year, I do recall, of course, this time last year we were talking about trends in the context of the work that we all do here on combating hate and extremism, its rise. And we were very much focused on the palpable rise in LGBTQ attacks, on the palpable rise in attacks on public officials. And we continue to see some of that. I think it's important to say these are constants. But as I said, here's where the change has really happened. George, over to you, perhaps, to start us off with the vital work that you're doing at the ADL and some of the data that you have here behind us.
Thank you, Sasha. It's great to be here again with you and Mark with you as well, two colleagues that I've had the good fortune of working with for many years. And thank you all for being here today in the audience, and a special thanks to Brett and the incredible team at the Eradicate Hate conference here. This is really one of the most preeminent gatherings of both thought leaders and practitioners across the country, and it's an honor for ADL to be here today and to be participating in this conversation. I wanted to start off this conversation with a grounding on where we are. As Brett alluded to on the podium just a few minutes ago, on the anniversary of the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in the history of the United States, the slide right behind me is a snapshot of the current state of hate as it relates to anti-Semitic incidents in the United States. Post October the 7th of 2003, roughly through October the 7th of 2024, over a 12-month timeline, there's been approximately 10,000 anti-Semitic incidents across the United States. This statistic is the largest single-year recording of anti-Semitic incidents since the ADL has been recording anti-Semitic incidents since 1979. And so, Sasha, to your question is, what is the state of hate? I wish I could come here and report, as you alluded to, that we've made great progress. I wish I could report that new initiatives have catalyzed communities coming together, pushing back against anti-Semitism, hate, and extremism of all forms. But what I'm here to report on behalf of both ADL and many of our partners here in the room today is that the proliferation of tropes, conspiracy theories, and hate-filled ideology has produced one of the largest years, the largest year on record of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States.
Thank you, George. As we've seen over and over, offline, real-world attacks, real-world incidents track with online activity. And as many of you know, at ISD, we detect and monitor weaponized hate and extremism across an entire ecosystem of online platforms. And what we've seen this last year is a very, very dramatic uptick, as you'll see from this slide, in the volume of anti-Semitic speech and in the volume of anti-Muslim speech across, again, the entire ecosystem of online platforms from fringe to mainstream. And I'd love to come back to that problem of mainstream platforms and some of the enormous failures that we've seen in terms of platform accountability and transparency around some of this. What we also see, of course, is that picture that George has just presented in terms of the incidents offline in hate crime is a global phenomenon. And here we've seen in the UK, for instance, hate crimes against Jewish people more than doubled from the previous year. Again, tracking with this online picture, and crimes against Muslims rose by 13%, making up the largest category of religious hate crimes in the United Kingdom this year. There's a couple of aspects to this online picture that I thought would be helpful to underscore, and then would love to pass the floor to my old friend, Mark Wallace, who knows, of course, a lot about many of these aspects of the threat. One is that in addition to the mobilization of hate by a whole slew of extremist groups, from the hard left to the far right, to Islamist extremist categories, we see, in addition to that, and I will say many of these aspects of hate, anti-Semitism sits at the sort of heart. It's a thread. It's a common thread across these forms of extremist activity. We also see the exploitation of international events, like what we see playing out in Gaza, exploited by the Kremlin and its information operations, by Iran and its cyber and information operations around the world, increasingly active in the United States since October 7th, and indeed by the Chinese Communist Party, where we've seen a very much more aggressive stand in terms of their information operations, with the stoking of anti-Semitic content across the United States, with a view to stoking divides, amplifying wedge issues in the context of an already fraught election year. So I wanted to come to some of those aspects of the problem before we turn to the role of social media. Mark, you've done a lot of work on Iran for so long. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about where you see the root causes of some of the problems that we've seen now, particularly in the anti-Semitic space. Talk to us about what you're seeing.
First of all, thank you, Sasha. George, it's great to see you. And for perspective, this panel is like old home week. We've been working together for so long. And as I think the elder statesman on the stage, actually, because I'm the oldest, I got to work with Lord Weidenfeld and Abe Foxman before that. And we've been doing this a long time. And in answer to your question, I'm going to give you an answer that you might not expect. I certainly can speak. I run another group called United Against Nuclear Iran, and I focus on Iranian nuclear proliferation and mischief in the region. Certainly the malign actor. But I think what we are suffering from is a collective failure of us to recognize the problem and take the actions that we need to take. For too long, I was raised, and others were raised, to say, let's never forget. Let's go to our memorials or museums, and by never forgetting, we're bearing witness and never having it be enough. Even in anticipation of this discussion, there was a hesitancy to talk about anti-Semitism exclusively or too much because we didn't want to overbalance it. As Jews, we have to recognize that never forgetting is not enough. We have to do more rather than just bear witness. So I would say that the biggest challenge that we face is a bit of a collective failure of all of us because we took for granted that the humanity that we show by never forgetting would be enough. And I think now, because of the tragedies we've seen that we've all suffered, we all now are motivated and ready to do more. And I think there are things that we can do more. We talk about speech. In the early teens, I testified against the social media companies and said, you must remove extremist content online. After we had a debate with them about removing child exploitation and abuse online, child pornography. And it was a fight, and they were mean, and they were angry. How dare that we challenge their content. And now we're having a discussion on slides about the rise of anti-Semitic content online. We have to, it's a trite expression, but I'm going to use it because I think it's useful. We need a paradigm shift in the way we approach this. We need to say no, that the economic model of social media companies in promoting this stuff is wrong. There has to be a change in that effort, and that has to be different. As Jews, we have to do more than just never forgetting. We have to fight the war of indoctrination and education, reclaim our educational institutions. We have to do more. My colleague was Senator Lieberman. He passed recently. He's a great man. I had the privilege of eulogizing him. My last conversation with him was, Mark, we have to do so much more. I can't believe at my time that we're confronting these issues today. And the fact that as Jews, we are defensive in some way about raising anti-Semitism as the key issue. We talked about ISIS when ISIS was the major issue. Al-Qaeda before that, Sasha led in far-right extremism. It's okay to talk about the scourge of anti-Semitism. And now in the post-Cold War period, that we're dealing with some of the worst anti-Semitism that we have ever experienced. We have to confront it at the educational level, we have to confront it online, and collectively as a people, we have to recognize that we have failed. I don't want to invoke that because the ADL and the ISD are two incredible groups worthy of your support, and these are stars sitting next to me. But collectively, we have failed in our approach, and we have to take a tougher version. It's no longer acceptable to say that anti-Semitism is a fellow traveler with some sort of terror group or extremist group. If you're an anti-Semite, you're engaging in extremist behavior. And as a lawyer who's dealt with these issues for many years, I'm going to touch the third rail. We don't have free speech in the United States of America. We choose and regulate what speech is good and bad. and we generally have free speech. But we have to take a decision to enforce the laws that we have and outlaw the material support of terrorist groups. When people are out supporting and protesting in support of Hamas and Hezbollah, they're providing material support to terror groups. So we can do this, but we need to change our thinking and not be defensive about it, and recognize in the post-war period, and I think we've all borne witness to that, no metaphor intended, we can do better because we have not, there has to be some recognition that we have not failed to address this in the right way. By the way, Iran and other state actors are, and answering your question directly because I didn't do it, have exploited the fissures of our democracy to drive wedges between us. The people that are good, that are trying to solve these problems, have not understood that those same fissures can be closed using democratic principles, and that we can use the same techniques to fight our enemies to prevent the spread of hate. We must do more. Sorry to go off track.
Mark, thank you so much. Absolutely right. Let me underscore some of the points you raised about social media, which I absolutely agree with some of our data. Last year, I shared with you here how extremists were still reaching large audiences on mainstream platforms, with a particularly notable 106% increase in anti-Semitism, 69% increase in pro-ISIS accounts, 69% increase in misogynist and abusive accounts, all on Twitter as the company got taken over by Elon Musk. This trend has exacerbated this last year. And I will say in the aftermath of October 7th, to your point, we found illegal, branded terrorist and violent extremist content. This is illegal content, even in America.
But it started in 2012. Remember,
Correct.
we had the fight. They didn't even want to remove it until about 2012 or 13.
Correct.
They refused to even monitor the content, Sasha.
And even that content, once flagged, remained, 90% of it remained on the platform 3 weeks after it was identified. In addition, we've seen this massive proliferation of weaponized hate off the back of viral disinformation. And we've seen that in the context of Southport in the United Kingdom, with the killings of 3 girls, spurring essentially nationwide riots, as we saw disinformation turn into weaponized hate at scale, with offline impacts of enormous proportions. Here, the hurricane season, this has been unbelievable to watch, where we saw again the speed, the descent of what was viral disinformation turn overnight into rabid anti-Semitic attacks. This isn't just speech, these were attacks and threats against public officials based on their religion. Totally terrifying in the context, again, of what we are here to do in Pittsburgh.
Sasha, isn't it not free speech? I think we're all wrapped around the axle of free speech.
Correct.
Because
I agree with you entirely. Let me just say one last thing on this. Here's what happened. The recommender systems themselves, once people had watched 1 or 2 or 3 pieces of this kind of content, started to feed them more of that rabid anti-Semitic content, something that we've seen across a whole range of different harms. And I agree with you, Mark. That is not free speech.
It's terms of service.
That's right. That's a curated speech environment where they get to decide essentially
what's economic.
Correct, because it's engagement for profit.
Right. And that's the difference. We talk about free speech. Whenever you hear a social media company or an online platform raise free speech, you know they're lying, because every one of them has a terms of service. They decide what is economically wise for them to have on their platform to monetize their revenue. And they monetize this conflict, this hate, and it inures to their benefit. There's all sorts of things you can't see online that are constitutionally protected. But supporting a terrorist group or engaging in anti-Semitic or racist or other behavior is somehow not. We fought this fight in 2012 and 13. We'd been monitoring content for years, flagging it, and they kept saying they were the telephone line. When a social media company comes to you and they start talking free speech and say, what's your terms of service? Because supporting a terrorist group isn't part of the terms of service, but apparently making money is.
Thank you, Mark. I completely agree. Let me turn to you, George, because, of course, you sat across a coordination task force in US government at the very height of the ISIS threat globally. You were looking at this issue also in terms of this enormous marketing campaign that ISIS successfully ran across social media. You started work on engaging with those platforms. tell me your thoughts now. You know, how far has that gotten? What do you feel is still needed in that regard?
I feel like the points you're both making, underscore the amateur approach that we continue to take to this problem set, and you're both addressing it. But I think there's a third element as we collectively introduce the conference and the gathering here to the state of hate. We can talk about offline and we can talk about online. There's a relatively new-ish sector that we should be talking about that has not been the mainstay of the past 4 years of this convening, which is the hate and extremism that we've seen in the past 12 months on college and university campuses across the United States and across the globe. While that is very much in the online or offline kind of real-world space, let's just think that not long ago, and Sasha, to your point about the counterterrorism era, the counter-ISIS era, in the height of the war against ISIS, I never imagined there would be an incident in Washington, D.C., on one of the statues in front of Union Station, if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., and you've ever taken the train, where someone spray painted with red spray paint, "Hamas is coming." That's not hyperbole. That's not well, could you imagine if? That was an actual incident that happened. And so the fact that for the 20-plus year period of the global war on terror, that the cases, the investigations, the arrests, the prosecutions by the American government and our partners across the country, and our collective coming together to address the extremism, radicalization in this country, the fact that in this period, in the past 12 months, we've seen a 500% increase in anti-Semitic incidents on college and university campuses, and we've seen these one-offs like the spray painting of "Hamas is coming," a designated foreign terrorist organization, basically in the shadow of the Capitol. That to me strikes a bit of a different chord and a bit of a different theme, that we're talking about online rhetoric and the fomenting of anti-Semitism and extremism. We're talking about real-world incidents, but this new paradigm, this new pillar that we should be looking at of what's happening on college and university campuses and the contributory factors, I think that's a relevant part of the conversation as well.
I mean, yes, Mark, do you want to come in on this?
Look, I want to invoke Senator Lieberman's passing is recent to me, and I miss him dearly. At his eulogy, I mentioned he didn't want anybody to know. He had hosted the first meeting of the Abrahamic Accords, and he didn't want anybody to know about it because other people went on and did a lot with it. He said it was just great enough that this happened. And it was quintessentially his ethos and the ethos of American Jewry, that we put our nose down and we do our work and we contribute to society and we work hard and we do great things. But now the college campuses are so clear. We have to be not bashful about going to the universities, going to the high schools, and having studies, critical thought, where we examine these issues and are not afraid to talk about it, rather than not just saying we can't forget. And we're seeing that happen all the time. Look, I'm in New York, and Georgia, you talk about that. I don't understand, as a guy that's ostensibly an expert on sanctions and material support for designated terrorist groups, I don't understand when you have people holding flags and demonstrating and spray painting buildings, how that is not material support for terrorism. And it should be enforced. They should be arrested, they should be prosecuted, and we have to make it clear that's not speech. That's material support for a designated terrorist group, and we have to take action to do that.
Well, there's three things that we've seen in terms of the challenges posed to us by social media. One, Mark, is the problem that you've just alluded to, which is the fact that social media platforms have by and large failed to enforce their own terms of service, their own rules in relation to terrorist and violent extremist content, disinformation, hate speech. And we see that patchy enforcement become even more problematic outside of English language contexts. Often in the most vulnerable environments, we see the worst possible activities on social media going completely unchecked, with dire implications for peace, for stability, and we see violence really stemming from the viral aspects of social media speech. The second big problem is that we see the most extreme, sensationalist content, essentially amplified by the technological architecture of social media. The algorithmic amplification of the content that comes closest to the red line of what is acceptable. We've monitored, we've evidenced, others have evidenced across every single harm you can think of. And again, it's often the most vulnerable users that get served up with the most dangerous potential content with devastating implications. There was an old Facebook study that was leaked that showed that 64% of joins to extremist groups were in fact the result of their own recommendations algorithm. I have that kind of data across so many of these threats.
It's not a new issue.
Correct.
Back in the days when ISIS was ISIS, there was a pathway on social media to become an ISIS bride or an ISIS fighter. And we had a fight with the social media companies to remove that. But that algorithm that you're talking about is the monetization of extremist content. And our opponents, including state actors that you alluded to, and these groups, exploit those algorithms to drive content that is then echoed and amplified. Look, I was speaking to a very prominent minister of a country far away, and he said, well, you know, we have an extremist problem. It's probably 100 people because it's a lovely country. But how do you deal with those 100 people? Those 100 people can do so much damage online, right? And they can do that. So we have to change the way we view this. Look, it was a battle to get the social media companies to take child pornography offline. It was a battle to take ISIS and Al-Qaeda offline in 2012 or 13, something like that. And now we have to renew that battle and on the college campuses.
So let's come to solutions here, because this gathering is about us really getting to the nuts and bolts of what we do about these problems. And as you said, there's been a collective failure. On just this social media point, let me just say there's been something of a ray of hope in Europe with the passing of legislation, social media regulation for the first time.
You were involved in that. We were all involved in that.
Correct. And we now have, number one, mandated transparency, access to data on the platforms that gives us an insight into the harms that we're talking about and the impact of their own systems on those harms for the very first time. Access to data that doesn't exist for an American context right now. And we're seeing a sort of widening gap, a gap between the haves and the have-nots in terms of regulation around social media. It's meant that in relation to this kind of illegal content that I mentioned in the aftermath of the 7th of October attack, we've had a lever, a policy lever, in a European context to address that problem online. That doesn't exist here.
I actually think Europe is the model. When you look at the laws and dealing with these issues, we throw out the Constitution like it's going out of style. And I've sworn oaths to the Constitution many times, and I believe in it strongly. But we can do much better prohibiting that speech that we find loathsome, because we do it across the board, because we choose which speech is loathsome collectively as a society. We have to be active, collective in our belief, and not allow that speech.
And essentially, this is regulation that speaks to the issues of manipulation, deception, and ultimately amplification, the kind of inorganic amplification of the worst stuff that the platforms themselves are responsible for. And I would hope that we can all work towards something of that kind here. Also, you're right, it's not a free speech environment right now. It's a curated speech environment. What this kind of transparency does for us is enable us to monitor not only under regulation, under moderation of terrorist, violent extremist content, but it also enables us to ensure that speech is free speech is preserved, because we can also monitor the extent to which there's been overreach in terms of the removal of content. So it serves all of our objectives here, and I hope we can move in that direction, but that's dealing with the supply side of the problem. George,
can I add one point to this?
Yeah, please.
So I want to bring in one of the themes that Mark brought up, which is, as we look at this problem set and we think about the policy levers that we have, like, let's look back at the past two administrations. And I want to make sure that we give proper airtime to Mark, what you alluded to, which is the Abraham Accords, which was one of the most seismic kind of policy shifts in the region in a long time for the better. Fast forward into from the Trump administration, fast forward into the Biden administration, the first ever national strategy to combat anti-Semitism, which is very relevant for this convening here today, and monumental in terms of all the work that's been done globally on addressing this issue set. If you look across the political lines in this country, and if you look across administrations coming in and going out, it's not just the Middle East component and foreign policy, and it's not just the domestic policy component. What we need to look forward to together in terms of, Sasha, your question, what do the solutions look like? It's knitting those two pieces together and making sure that the architecture domestically reflects the policy priorities and the funding streams internationally. And when those two come together with a private sector in the form of social media and other digital literacy efforts, those are the components I think that are part of the solution holistically.
Look what ADL was founded on: free speech and fighting anti-Semitism. They are not mutually exclusive. We can do both, right? You have a great history of that. But I think collectively now, and forgive me for railing on as part of it, I think I can rail on it, I guess. Collectively, Jewish philanthropy, Jewish activist groups have to come together and now are ready to fight because they've seen this. We have to come together, identify these discrete problems, and not be bashful about raising these issues.
I just want to come back to the point that you raised about the need for a real strategy.
Yeah.
That incorporates understanding the transnational aspects of the threat landscape, the geopolitical dimension of the threat landscape, and the way in which that plays out all the way through to the domestic and local level. And it is very palpable to see how hostile states are amplifying domestic networks, are piggybacking off of those domestic networks, and yet somehow that falls through the crack in terms of government response. I wanted to just think a little bit here now for this amazing group that's been convened here of practitioners, because at the end of the day, I see this as addressing both the supply side of the problem, but also the demand side of the problem. And for me, I see great potential. I get hopeful when I see the work of practitioners at a hyperlocal level and what they're able to do there. ISD is very proud to host the Strong Cities Network, which works with mayors and local communities on developing public health-based models for prevention. And in that context, we've seen mayors now look at these global threats, really handle the fallout at a very hyper-local level, bring together people. I know that there's an enormous amount of work that you're trying to do in that regard as well, George. I just would love to hear anything hopeful from the two of you about the things, the seeds for peace that matter in the work that you're doing.
Sure. I'll use my kind of final moment here. I don't know if I see them here. Is the Collins family in the room? Is the Collins family here in the? She just stepped out. I want to use my final minute not to talk about ADL. I want to use my final moment here not to talk about the rash of anti-Semitic incidents that we've seen across this country. I want to use my final minute here to talk about the Collins family. For those of you that don't know them, their son, Second Lieutenant Richard Collins, was tragically murdered at the University of Maryland campus, I believe in 2017. And I was briefly chatting with them last night, and they were telling me about a course that is now on the University of Maryland's main campus, as well as on Bowie State's campus. And so the moment of hope that I see in the work that I do in an organization that was founded because of rabid anti-Semitism in this country is actually to talk about the tragedy that their family experienced, to honor the memory of their son, and to use moments like this of a convening of this group to really focus our collective strength and our collective energy, to focus on what we can do together in this moment, to lift up the type of work that they're doing, which is impacting real people on college and university campuses in the same way that many of our programs across the country, K through 12 and college and university, are getting at hearts and minds. We need to continue to invest in these efforts with young people, while at the same time, as Mark and Sasha pointed out, being very explicit and very clear-eyed about calling out the hate, bias, and anti-Semitism that we see in all 50 states.
Thank you. Mark, last words of hope.
Hope. Look, I think what we see now is transnational oppression by hostile state actors. You have Iranian assassins or hired assassins running around trying to potentially kill people. You see the influence of hostile state actors online. This is a problem that's evolved between anti-Semitism and the rise of hate that has fluctuated a bit in the post-World War era, post-World War II era, but we have seen this problem for a long time. It will take, in my opinion, a generation to change, But we must approach college campuses, laws, and online with the same vigor that we feel when we have a loss, when we come to memorializing or never forgetting. We have to have the same energy and apply that to indoctrinating is the not right word, educating at college campuses, because we've been too afraid to do it because never forgetting was enough. And we have to call out the social media companies, the titans of industry, and say, enforce your damn terms of service. And we have to not be afraid to have a more European model. My organization, the Counter-Extremism Project, partners across Europe. Europe is the model where they do regulate this type of conduct much more than the United States, but we use the Constitution to hide behind responsibility, and we can't do that anymore. And I think there is a path. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There are many more trends, many more issues that we would have wanted to highlight in this session, but it's short, and I think we've come to really focus on some of the major changes over this last year. I do just want to say, as we see a hybridized threat landscape before us, where we see the mutual reinforcement by bad actors, from state actors through to hate groups, extremist groups of all ilks, it is vital that we connect the dots among ourselves, that we act strategically and in concert together, because we have the seeds of real response, of solutions to these threats that we collectively face in this very room with this incredible community that's been brought together here by Laura, by Brett. Thank you so much. And we're really looking forward to the coming 3 days of collective action. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.